Hello and welcome to episode 3 of CPCine, the Amstrad CPC video magazine. They say you never forget your first love. Well, mine was a big black guy called Arnold. Let's take a look at him. Before we start this episode's news roundup, I need to cover a glaring error made in episode 2. During the game and software releases, I failed to mention the release of Xanagrams, that game that everyone who got the Amsoft 12 pack no doubt remembers. I can't say for certain that it was a launch title, although it does seem likely, but it was certainly an early release and would have been available by August 1984. How can I know this for sure? Because it's clearly visible in the Amsoft software bundle on the back page of issue 1 of CPC 464 User, which means it had to have been published in time for the photo shoot for that advert. Apologies for the oversight, Xanagrams lovers. I'll aim to do better with my software spotting from here on in. In a similar vein, we can also tell that Gems of Stradus must have been released by the end of August 84 because there's a letter in CPC 464 User issue 2 complaining that the letter writer is stuck in this game. This same reader suggests that the connections diagram on the 464's data coder could be replaced by, and I quote, something useful, and helpfully suggests a list of ink colours would be a decent replacement. Would that suggestion catch on? 6128 users, feel free to let us know in the comments section below. The biggest news item for September 84, for me at least, is the revelation in the editorial section of CPC 464 User issue 2 that Amstrad has only just started advertising the CPC 464 to the general public. According to the magazine, the only information available about the CPC so far came through, and I quote, the initiated who read computer magazines. Given that all the CPC software in some computer stores literally sold out when the machine was released, that's some pretty well-initiated computer lovers in that case. Unfortunately, issue 1 of CPC 464 User is bi-monthly, so news is hard to come by for this episode. We will have a lot more next month, because issue 2 will be out by then, but sadly that's also a bi-monthly issue, so it doesn't bode well for Amstrad news in November unless information starts arriving from Popular Computing Weekly or a similar magazine around that time. So, with that in mind, let's move on. On the new releases front, we have a nice grab bag of titles. Games lovers can enjoy Despairing for the Future of Humanity while trying to play Roland on the Run, Sailing the High Seas in Roland Ahoy, Travelling Through Time and Space in Roland in Time, Seeking Treasure in Classic Adventure, the CPC's rendition of the first ever text adventure game, playing a part remake, part sequel to the original text adventure in Level 9's Colossal Adventure, the first of their Middle-earth trilogy, finding even more treasure and defeating evil Time Lords in another Level 9 adventure, Lords of Time, returning to Middle-earth in Level 9's Adventure Quest, and finishing off Level 9's Middle-earth trilogy with Dungeon Adventure, helping an amnesiac to discover who he is and what he's supposed to be doing in The Trial of Arnold Blackwood, playing snooker, kind of, in, well, snooker, playing rugby with armour on in American football, shooting aliens in Galaxian's clone Galaxia, saving the stricken spacecraft Snowball 9 in Snowball, continuing the adventure started in Snowball in its sequel, Return to Eden, charting a course through hostile waters in Admiral Graf Spee, a controversial title at the time due to the player taking control of the German vessel that sank the most Allied ships during World War II, playing a really nice Scramble clone in Star Avenger, and getting your ass handed to you at chess. Well, that's what happens when I play it anyway, in Master Chess. While we're on the subject of games, it seems last episode's list of potentially lost games has resonated with some viewers. Retro Mickey 82 recalls seeing a tape copy of Mr. Wimpy in the past, which suggests that game did indeed get released. If anyone has any information on this or any of the other lost games, I would love to hear from you in the comments section. Sticking with lost games, it's worth taking a moment to discuss Poster Paster. It started being advertised alongside Jammin' and Pipeline in issue 2 of CPC 464 User, and there are even mentions of it here and there online, but only in the form of what appears to be a recreation of the storyline from the game's inlay. Poster Paster was definitely released for the Commodore 64. There are videos of it on YouTube and several copies available on eBay, but the CPC version is nowhere to be seen. No videos, no copies on eBay, no downloads from the usual CPC sources, nothing. Did it actually get released, or is this another announced Amstrad game that failed to materialise? it seems unlikely given that it was supposed to be from Amsoft and it was advertised in the same advert as Jammin', which definitely got a release in the middle of 1985, so what happened? Does anyone have a copy of the game? And if so, can they share it with the rest of us? Because as far as we can tell, it's disappeared. And now I'll admit right now, there are theories that this never actually got released and didn't actually get further than a recreation of the Commodore 64 inlay in order to advertise the game as a potential release later, but we're not entirely sure, so if anyone has any information on this one, please do get in touch. And also, the same could be said about Pipeline, since it doesn't look like this ever came out either, although Super Pipeline did, and they may in fact be the same game, and as a result I haven't included that one in this list, but that could change of course. Now, let's take a look at the applications that have been released this month. It's a short list this time, but nevertheless, serious CPC users can look forward to discovering astronomy with Star Watcher, creating databases with Masterfile 464, and drawing some lovely pictures with Screen Designer. Amsoft even took the time to advertise the fact that Amsword, the big brother of launch title Easy Amsword, has now gone to the duplicators. It's due for release in November, which means it will be coming around at about the same time that the first disk drives arrive. That's good news for anyone writing a very long document on the CPCs, because saving a big text file to cassette can get very tiresome very quickly. I'll be trying out Amsword in an intense road test of the program in episode 5 when we cover its launch along with the other news from November 85, so look out for that, because I'll be trying to script the entire episode using that program, and I have no doubt that there'll be a lot of fun to be had along the way. Codename Matt is one of those early Amsoft titles that never really grabbed me as a kid. I saw it in the Amsoft catalogues back in the day, and the cover plus the screenshots didn't really make it look like the kind of game I would have been interested in at the time. To be honest, having now played it, I was probably right. I was very young when the CPC launched, and as we saw in episode 2's game roundup, this is one of the earliest games for the system, so when it launched, I honestly believe it would have gone right over my head. Coming to it now, as an older and more experienced gamer, I'm really impressed with its depth of gameplay. This isn't a standard arcade shoot 'em up by any stretch of the imagination. The gameplay is split over a surprising number of sectors of space, and you can tackle them in any order, providing you manage to successfully warp between sectors. That's no mean feat. It gets very difficult to stay on course when you're warping across long distances, and on more than one occasion I found myself accidentally crashing out of warp right into an intense space battle. The controls are decent enough, with joystick being the best means to get to grips with the action, although you'll find yourself reaching for the keyboard a lot in order to perform some of the many functions on your ship, such as bringing up the sector map to find out where the baddies are, and then engaging a warp drive to fly to them. In many ways, I'm reminded of Star Wars X-Wing, an intense and really in-depth space combat flight sim from the 90s. And while I'll freely admit the game doesn't live up to that absolute classic from LucasArts, Codename Matt is nevertheless a really fun game that I'm glad it finally did give a chance to after all of these years. My younger self may not have found a lot to like in this game, but the me of today certainly did. Give it a chance if you're into space combat, I think you'll like it. Now let's take a look at a software package that every serious Amstrad user has at the very least heard of, if not used at some point. It's Hisoft's famous Dev Pack, a Z80 assembler, disassembler and monitor suite that lets you do pretty much everything it's possible to do with an Amstrad CPC. Hisoft are well-established purveyors of high-quality serious software in the ZX Spectrum arena, so when it came to establishing a foothold in Amstrad's new system, they had a pretty easy time of things. The CPC uses the same processor as the ZX Spectrum, so Hisoft were able to port over their DevPack program in much less time than they would have if they were coding it all from scratch, and they were able to enhance it while they were doing so to take advantage of the Amstrad's more enhanced features. The end result is something very special. DevPack is an extremely powerful piece of software that is able to put all of the functions of the Z80 processor and the CPC's firmware right into the hands of coders. The manual that comes with the software is well written, and although it's not comprehensive, it does in fact recommend that you buy both the firmware guidebook from Amstrad and also Rodney Zach's Programming the Z80 book in order to get fully to grips with assembler coding on the Amstrad. But it does still give you a firm base on which to start writing your own CPC software in assembly language. I was never an assembly coder back in the 80s or 90s, I took a GCSE in IT in the mid-90s, and while we discussed assembly language briefly, it was only in comparison to the other languages that were in use when coding computers at that time. In all honesty, the GCSE was a complete waste of time, and I could have better spent those 2 years sat at a computer for an hour a week with a teach-yourself coding book. But that's all in the past now. Let's get back to what we're actually here for. How does DevPack work on the CPC? Well, I'm happy to say it works really, really well. The language itself is a little odd to get to grips with, and I recommend you sit down with a manual in one hand, a notepad in the other, and the 2 reference books that the manual recommends sitting close to hand. You can download DevPack, its manual, the firmware guide, and programming the Z80 all from the CPC wiki, and I recommend you do so if you want to give this software a try. As you would expect, everything is lightning fast when written in assembler, even when it's being compiled and run in memory inside the assembler software. And yes, it's possible to have the compiler running so you can code, and then not just compile that code in memory, but also run the code there and then in order to test it. I'm very impressed with that. So far I've only written short and very basic code using DevPack, because I've only just started getting to grips with it for this short review. But I can easily see myself delving deeper into Z80 coding and really enjoying doing it. It's a great piece of software. DevPack is well written, I had absolutely no problem getting to grips with it right away, and I say that as someone who has spent less than an hour with assemblers before I sat down to try out DevPack. I won't make any claims to being a master coder. I've written a few bits and pieces here and there in stuff like BASIC, Graphic Adventure Creator, Fortran 95, C++, LSL and PHP, but never in a low-level language like assembler, so this was all very, very new to me. Thankfully, the manual walks you through everything, and I quickly found myself getting to grips with the Z80 in a way that I never would have expected to before. I didn't expect to be making anything amazing when coding in assembler, but after I found it so easy to get to work with this software, I will admit that I've started thinking about how I could make a small game, or maybe even my own disc magazine, in Z80 assembler with DevPack. That's how easy it was to get started when working through the DevPack manual. I'm immensely impressed, and my only regret is that I didn't start sooner. Highsoft has certainly earned the intense praise they got with this one. I love it. Now let's move away from the world of Z80 programming and come back to Earth with something in BASIC. As I mentioned in episode 2, Popular Computing Weekly said that they really wanted to feature more of the Amstrad CPC in their pages, but they really relied on reader submissions to do so. Well, it's ask and ye shall receive time, because here's the very first reader submitted type-in for the CPC in Popular Computing Weekly. Their 27th of September 1984 issue includes Animated Fans, a short program that draws and then animates some fans of varying sizes while playing a sound. Let's take a look at it. On my first typing of this, it seems I screwed up some of the code because I got something that didn't represent a fan whatsoever and just looked like a bunch of lines. I'm not sure it's any better on the second typing, to be honest. It's a very basic program, and the noise gets annoying very quickly, even for someone as hard of hearing as I am. There's not a lot to this program either. It's mainly a set of 4 next loops that set the timer for the changes between inks, which is how the animation works. In that respect, it's a lot like the amateur porn program from CPC 464 user issue 1, because the animation is handled solely by switching between visible and invisible inks at a certain frequency in order to simulate movement. But don't worry, the type-ins will become far more interesting and far more advanced as we progress through the history of the CPC range. For the moment, let's just move on. Meanwhile, over in CPC 464 user, we have another simple graphics demo. Well, it seems simple at least, but it's actually doing some rather cool things. For example, let's take a look at the Color Bar program, which is option 3 on the menu once this particular type-in is run. At first glance, the Color Bar program simply displays some coloured bars on the screen. It looks rather simple, something that anyone with a small amount of basic knowledge could knock up in a few minutes. But how it's doing it is actually rather smart. You see, those coloured bars aren't being drawn on the screen. They aren't a graphic. They aren't even a set of characters in multiple colours arranged to fill the screen. Those are windows with different colours in them. This simple program is building on what we discussed back in episode 1 when we talked about the advanced features that set the CPC apart from other microcomputers available at the time. Each coloured section on this screen is operating separately to every other section on the screen. If we wanted to, we could have all of those sections displaying text or graphics independently of one another, and because they're not set up to overlap, the graphics and the text would not clash. The window function is being used here simply to display a different set of colours, but the method used is really cool. And if users back in the day were to input this code after reading about the various methods of using the window command, they would have learnt a bit more about their computer and also seen the command in operation to reinforce that knowledge. That's pretty smart writing. Similarly, the way the bandwidth/geometry program is coded also tells us a lot about how CPC BASIC functions. If you look at the code, you'll see several for next loops being used to plot a point on the screen. It doesn't look like an awful lot is going on, but when you see the program running, you get a better idea of what it's doing. The program draws a circle on a grid, and then draws a series of lines on the screen inside the circle, with the lines getting closer and closer together as the computer draws them across the screen. Was it necessary to plot those lines by drawing individual points on the screen? No, absolutely not. But it's interesting that the coders chose to do that because it teaches the person typing the code in, and remember this is still in issue 1 of the official magazine, so many of the readers will be new to the computer and not entirely familiar with how the CPC 464 works just yet. It teaches them 4 important things about CPC BASIC. Firstly, it shows that 4 next loops can be embedded inside one another. On line 540, we begin a loop that defines which Y coordinate we'll be plotting to. We also count backward from line 287 on the screen to line 100. The fact that 4 next loops can run backwards is very useful to know. Next we have a series of loops to determine which X coordinate we use for plotting, and these run forward in steps, which means that the user is learning that 4 next loops don't have to go up or down 1 integer at a time. That is very useful to know as well. After that, we see how the plot command works, which is useful to anyone who either hasn't read the basic foundation course in the manual, or who didn't get along with how that course is laid out. We see that the plot command takes 3 variables, the X coordinate, the Y coordinate, and the number of the pen to write with. Again, that's really useful. So, 4 interesting features of CPC BASIC in one short subroutine in the code. I'm always impressed by how well structured these example programs are in CPC 464 user. The writers were really good. There's one more thing I wanted to cover with this program, and that's on line 50. This is an interesting line of code because, again, it teaches us 2 things at once. See how it begins with an apostrophe? That's to show us that the code won't be executed on that line. In CPC BASIC, an apostrophe used at the start of the line, or just after a semicolon, is interpreted by the CPC the same way as the rem command is. It tells the CPC to ignore anything written after that mark or command because it's a remark, i.e. it's a message for the user, not for the computer. Removing the apostrophe and running the program shows the user that it's possible to prevent a person running the code from breaking into the basic code by pressing the escape key twice, which is how people normally start reading basic code from a program that they're running. Essentially, this is a line of code that turns the basic type-in into a protected basic program, albeit a very low-grade one. The onBreak-Go subcode is telling the computer that when it encounters a command to halt the program and break into the code, it should go to a specific line in the listing and follow the instructions there. In this case, the line in question simply says run, which essentially turns a double press of the escape key into a quick way to get back to the main menu so the user can select a new test pattern. I used the onBreak command a lot in my programs back when the CPC was my main computer, as it was a good way to quickly ensure that people couldn't simply break into my games and change the code. It's by no means a foolproof method, of course, since it doesn't counteract anyone with the sense to load a program from the ready prompt instead of simply running it, but it is useful for people who are already in the program who might want to give themselves an unfair advantage on the next playthrough of the game. Amstrad knew it had its work cut out, making a space in the crowded home computer market for the CPC 464, and the key to the computer's long-term success would be its software. Amstrad needed a lot of programs and a lot of steady releases over a prolonged period of time if the 464 was going to succeed. But there were only so many professional coders in the world and only so many hours in the day, so where was the software that Amstrad needed going to come from? The answer was simple: encourage homebrew developers to make software that would otherwise never exist, let alone come out on a rival system. That's where CPC 464 User Magazine came in. The method was simple: run a competition with a high enough prize pot that people would be incentivized not only to write their own games and applications, but which would also clearly show that the bar for success was going to be very high indeed. in 1984, £2,000 was a huge amount of money. It's the equivalent of a magazine giving out a £6,200 prize pot today, so the stakes were high. The rules of the contest were pretty simple. You submit a program that is your own work, or the work of yourself and your teammates, so long as you all agree. The program submitted must be on a cassette, so no printed out type-ins were allowed, and the program could be anything: a game, a serious application, an educational title, maybe even a demo. If you won, you got a cheque for £2,000, and Amstrad got full copyright ownership of the winning entry, which they could then release commercially or in the pages of CPC 464 user. Basically, it's a not too uncommon publishing contract for the time, with a side order of possible magazine publication. Programs could be in any language, and the winner seems to have been in BASIC, and it's not what I was expecting to see when I first looked at what the first winner was, let's put it that way. It's Beat the Clock by Philip Heathershaw, and issue 2 of CPC 464 user gives us a quick rundown of the program. Basically, it's a computerized version of a round of TV show Countdown crossed with a crossword generator. If you're now imagining a game of Xanagrams in reverse order and on a strict timer, then you're in the ballpark of what Beat the Clock is. The game is a little slow to get starting, probably because the CPC has a lot of processing to do when you first run it. But I'm actually very impressed with it once it gets going. There's a lot of fun to be had with this title, and I think the simplicity of its format works in its favour. At the time, the judges praised its use of graphics and sound, claims that I don't think hold up quite as well today as they did back then, but in all fairness, the standard of graphics wasn't high at the time, so maybe it was a valid comment for 1984. Beat the Clock comes in at just under 600 lines of basic code, with several of those being data entries, suggesting the game relies on a reasonable amount of machine code routines in order to keep things running at a brisk pace. It takes up 16k of memory, plus an additional 3k on the disk or tape for the Amsoft loader that was stuck on the front of it. That's pretty good going for a game of that era, and if I'm honest, I can see why this would be a contender for the first prize in any contest. My only criticism is that there doesn't appear to be any way to indicate that you've used up all of your letters. If you manage to place every letter on the board, you have to wait for the timer to run out before you can move on. It's a small criticism, but if you've managed it a few times, it's going to get a bit irksome. Still, it's a damn good game, especially given the short timescale it must have been coded in. So, well done, Mr. Heathershaw. Of course, this wouldn't be the last time that we saw a contest of this size from the pages of CPC 464 user. In future episodes, we'll cover the other winners of the future contests, each of which will be an equally interesting program, I'm sure. Bhavas Palace is a brilliant new puzzle platformer from Rafael Castillo and John McLean. It came first in the recent CPC Retro Dev 2017 collection, and deservedly so. The game is relatively simple in its mechanics. You're a small child who must navigate around a screen, moving blocks to enable you to defeat skeletons. Sounds simple, right? Well, it is at first, but it gets really tricky really quickly, and that's where the fun begins. This is a beautiful little puzzle game with some very well thought out puzzles to solve once you get past the introductory screens. It plays very nicely, the CPC Tellera development software is being put to great use here, and it looks beautiful. The music, made using the Arcos One Tracker program, is also very lovely, which is just the icing on the cake. If you don't know what CPC Tellera and Arcos Tracker are, we will be covering them both in later episodes, so be sure to tune in for those. All in all, this is one modern game that you really must play. I had a lot of fun with it, and I'm going to head off to have even more fun once I've finished making this episode. And with 100 levels to play through, I won't be running out of game to play anytime soon. Now I know not everyone enjoys a good puzzle game as much as I do, so let's take a look at a game with a more arcadey feel to it. This is Get the Cash by Ross Simpson. It's programmed in Highsoft Pascal, and it's rather fun to play. The mechanics are simple. Avoid the brick walls while speeding along at a breakneck speed, collecting bags of money with your claw-like grip. There are a set number of bags that you must collect in order to move on to the next stage, but each stage is randomly generated, with brick walls and money bags flying down the screen at you at very high speed. And if that's not making things difficult enough for you, your paddle on the screen moves up a few lines each time you grab a bag, so you have less and less time to react to the oncoming walls each time you grab the cash. You'll certainly need to keep your wits about you to play this one. I had a lot of fun with this game. It reminds me a lot of Star Dodger, a game that I used to type in and play a lot, from a booklet that came with an issue of Amstrad Action one Christmas, only with a collect-em-up twist to it. It's great fun, and I highly recommend giving it a go. It'll pass 5 minutes, or maybe even 50 minutes, with ease. And that's all we've got time for this episode. I'm sorry it's a little delayed this time thanks to a lot of stuff going on here, but with a bit of luck and a trailing wind, we'll be back to our fortnightly schedule in no time. So I hope to see you back here very soon for the next episode, when we'll be taking a look at how the CPC was faring back in October 1984. See you then!